Hello and welcome to this Bioprocess International Ask the Expert webcast. I'm your host, Leah Rosen, the online editor for Bioprocess International. Before we get started, just a couple of notes. This webcast is being recorded and will be made available for replay in the multimedia section of our website. We've muted the audio lines, but we welcome you to type in your questions for our speaker in the chat window on your screen. After the presentation, we will begin the question and answer portion, and I will ask our speakers your questions from the chat window. Your questions in the chat window will only be visible to myself and our speakers. So thank you for joining us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Eric Langer from Bioplan Associates and Scott Wheelwright from Complya Asia.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you, Bioprocess International, for supporting this, what I think is one of the most important webinar series this year. My name is Eric Langer. I'm managing partner at Bioplan Associates in Rockville, Maryland. Together with the Society for Industrial Microbiology and Biotechnology, we're bringing you through these webinars a focused summary of some of the findings that we've identified in our recently released Advances in Biopharmaceutical Technology in China, second edition. This is a peer-reviewed assessment of the trends and drivers and the challenges and opportunities that are emerging in China. It's based on over 100 internationally recognized authors, including today's esteemed seminar speaker, Scott Wheelwright. First, though, before we launch in today's discussion, I wanted to share just a few points regarding China and China's input into the biopharma environment and the context around which Scott's conversation will be rolling today. Start again. This is what is really driving China biopharma today. 7,500 cancer deaths every single day estimated in China, and 12,000 new cancer diagnoses every day in China. That's a massive number compared to what it is in the Western world, and the availability and opportunities that the biopharmaceutical therapies have to address some of the clinical needs in this region are really what's driving this. This isn't really about the economics. It's not really about developing an industry segment necessarily. This is about ensuring that you're dealing with the public health crisis that's associated with this level of healthcare challenge. And just to put in a little more context, 290 million Chinese have cardiovascular disease. That's greater than the adult population of all of the U.S. combined. So this is really a critical issue here, and is how the biopharmaceutical industry can address some of these driving clinical needs. And I want to digress for a second. China is according to USA Today, to be the #1 retail market in this year. China is going to top, if it hasn't already, the U.S. is the largest retail market. It's growing at 7.5% to $5.2 trillion, making millions in the middle class. Why this is relevant to healthcare is that the first expenditure when you have disposable income is healthcare. You don't buy cell phones. You ensure that you have the healthcare, the health insurance, the third-party payer opportunities. So a little bit of a step backward in terms of the Made in China initiatives that we've all heard about. As you know, China makes 60% of the world's buttons, a major component of the world's cars. They have major ownership in U.S. general aviation, high-tech aviation industries, meaning that they can and do perform in highly regulated environments in the West as well as in Asia. They also own nearly 8% of the global bioprocessing facilities around the world. In China. However, that said, in a recent study we did, when we were asking the China's biopharmaceutical manufacturers what their challenges are, they recognized that over 2/3 understood that China is simply not prepared for global bioprocessing. 68% that they have an overall quality image that essentially relates to the inability to be able to produce biologics at the level required for GMP export sales. So when we talk about Made in China initiatives and export, and you think about how this China is moving into this environment, you recognize that China's move into biologics is really initially about a domestic need, meeting a domestic So however, that said, when we look at China's biopharma's focus in, say, 6 years, by 2026, when we asked, 86% of China's biopharmaceutical manufacturers in 2026 expect to be producing for export to the U.S. and EU versus 28% in 2016. So that's a very significant shift in the strategy and the expectation, a 10-year strategy for being able to move into an export GMP environment. So ultimately then the old question has been for 15 years, can China move from the world's factory for toys, electronics, and commodities into a more technologically complex environment, regulated environment, especially as it relates to biologics? And I hypothesize, and we hypothesized in our study, can China be expected not to advance its healthcare segment, given what we had just talked about? So the new question, I believe, is going to be how will regulators, how will suppliers, and how will biomanufacturers participate in this growth? So I'd like to turn that conversation and that question over to our speaker today.
Thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate an opportunity to be with the audience today and to share some insights into biopharmaceutical manufacturing in China. Let me first begin with a brief introduction. I work for a company called Complya Asia. We focus on QA compliance and regulatory compliance. We are located in the Shanghai area in China, but we cover all of China as well as parts of Japan and Korea and India in our work. My background is having lived and worked in various different countries, including Germany, the U.S., China, India, and Japan. I've been in China now for 10 years, helping companies with their GMP compliance, with their audits, and performing inspections. Before that, I worked in various biotechnology companies in the U.S. We have many clients that we've served throughout the years. And today I'd like to talk about the rapid expansion of biopharmaceutical development and manufacturing in China. And when we think about biopharmaceuticals, it's interesting to compare China, as Eric did for patients, and the U.S. and Europe in terms of manufacturing. So when you look at the total portion of pharmaceutical sales that are biopharmaceuticals, worldwide it went from 13% in 2006 to 23% in 2014. It continues to rise. But in China, we're still at less than 10%. Now we expect that to increase over the next several years, but that is a major shortfall in terms of being able to supply these life-saving drugs to the people who need them. Now, recognizing this challenge, there are several incentives that have come into the market and are provided by the government in order to encourage the development of these drugs and increase manufacturing. We will take a look at these one by one as we go through the next several slides. There are three classes of companies I'd like to begin with and explain how these companies differ from one another, and in order to better understand the situation here in China. So we have some very large integrated Chinese companies. They have large capital funds available. Hisun and Lizon are examples of these. They have many divisions. Some of the biggest ones, like Sinopharm, are state-owned. They are huge. But they have historically been in the small molecule drug business and have only recently moved into biopharmaceuticals. Then we have a group of smaller startups. Now, most of these are founded by what we call returnees. These are Chinese-born scientists who moved to the U.S. or Europe and got their degrees and went to work for well-respected companies and then have come back to China. Now, sometimes these found subsidiaries of large companies. An example is Henlius, which is a subsidiary of Fosun. They were the first on the market with a biosimilar antibody in China. And Genor, which has been a subsidiary of Wallbacks, but not all of them are subsidiaries. Some are completely independent, like Innovent, which I got to help start, and we founded that about 7 or 8 years ago. And Innovent raised money on its own and has stayed independent all this time and is now a very large company. But these are the types of, they start out as startups, they're founded by attorneys, and then they become real biotech companies with products on the market. Now, the third group I'd like to talk about is the Contract Development and Manufacturing Organization. There are a dozen or so of these in the China area. The largest of these is WuXi Biologics. They have a very large capacity and are a very well-known and well-respected company worldwide. JHL is a Taiwan company that has manufacturing capacity in China, and they also do contract work. And then Boehringer Ingelheim, which is a very major player in the European markets, has a division in Shanghai which does contract work. Let's talk about types of biopharmaceuticals in China. So the focus of most companies that are developing biopharmaceuticals in China is on the mammalian cell culture products, including monoclonal antibodies. But there are others, there's bispecifics, and there's some recombinant proteins that are also being made here. And then there are the microbial culture products, but by and large, this is limited to insulin and insulin analogs. So very big markets, but lower margins, lower prices. Now let's talk about what is driving some of the changes, particularly by the government. So these are the changes in government policy. We'll go through these one at a time. Let's start with reduced IND review time. Okay, in 2016, just a few years ago, the average review time for an IND, that is from the day you submit the IND to the regulatory agency until you can enroll your first patient in your phase 1 trial, exceeded 24 months. Now, contrast that to the U.S., where one gets to submit their IND, wait for 30 days, and then enroll patients. This was a very severe burden on companies because you had to support all these people for 2 years while you're waiting for the agency to review your IND. And they had a backlog of over 1,000 applications. Now, because of this time it took, they allowed 3 lab scale batches at the 10-liter scale in the submission. You didn't have to do any GMP batches, and you could wait to do GMP batches until approval. Now, in 2017, this time was reduced to 6 months, and they brought the backlog down to 0. They changed the rule to require 3 batches, but one of these has to be GMP, so no longer just a 10-liter batch at the laboratory scale. And as a consequence, the production of GMP material now happens sooner. The current rule, which is in effect, requires the government actually to approve the IND within 60 working days of when the application is filed. Okay? So this has a very positive impact on company cash flow, and is a very big incentive to more companies getting into the biopharmaceutical development business. Now, another change, which was brought about by the government, was so in China, as in other communist countries in the past, China has a 5-year plan every 5 years. This is a national plan that emphasizes what the country is going to focus on. It's kind of a strategic plan for national business. In the most recent 5-year plan, which was issued just a few years ago, biotechnology was listed as one of the most important 21st century development areas. And in particular, a spotlight was placed on new vaccines, antibodies, and other major biological drugs. Also, drug design and new drug research and development were emphasized. The consequence of this is shown in the next slide. Okay, so because the national government says it's now okay to focus on these types of drugs, that means local governments can assist companies to expand their facilities and expand their capabilities at a lower risk. So all governments are risk averse, and in the U.S. and Europe and everywhere else in the world, governments provide incentives for companies. Think about Amazon in New York. They can provide very large incentives to build and locate their facilities in that particular local government area so that they can hire people, pay taxes, and pay wages. So the direction has been given to local governments, and what they do is they reduce land price, and they offer non-dilutive loans. That is, they loan money to the company. They may take stock, but then they'll give that stock back at some future point if the company meets its goals. They'll provide building construction. They'll actually front the money for the construction of the buildings and allow the company to move in there at a reduced or deferred rate of rent. And in some cases, they will provide money to purchase capital equipment, such as bioreactors and chromatography skids. Another change, which is very significant from the government, is what we call the Marketing Authorization Holder, the NIH Rule. In the past, now in the U.S., this was a similar situation in the past. About 30 years ago, we had a BLA and an ELA, and the manufacturer of the drug put his name on the label, even if he wasn't the developer of the drug. That changed about 30 years ago. That changed in Japan about 20 years ago, and it just changed this year nationwide in China. Previous rules prohibited the use of a contract manufacturing organization for production of commercial biopharmaceuticals, which meant that local Chinese CDMOs would only make materials for phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trial, because the phase 3 trial needs to be made at the commercial facility. So this new policy was an experimental policy for 2 years in 10 regions, and now is nationwide. That means it opens all of the geography of the country for CDMOs and CMOs. It means any company may use, well, not vaccines. This is not true for vaccines yet, but for all biopharmaceuticals, development company can use a CMO for production of the commercial product. Okay? This makes it much easier because now the development company doesn't have to invest in a manufacturing plant. There's still a limitation that the drug substance and drug product must be made at the same site. So there are some very good fill-finish sites in China, but they're not allowed to make commercial material at this point. We expect that to change just as the other rule changed, but we'll see when. This has a very positive impact on the cash flow of startups, as it means less money goes into capital and more money can go into clinical trials. And because CMOs tend to be more efficient, that means that there's a better efficiency and better use of the funds. So another very positive thing that happened in recent years is that China advanced into the International Conference of Harmonization, and as such, they are now obligated to follow the ICH guidelines. So the Chinese have a CGMP that is in a legal format, just as it is in the U.S. and Europe, and it's very much modeled on European standards, so it's very similar. In the past, it has not been enforced as thoroughly as the Europeans and the U.S. enforce their standards, but things are improving in China. But because of this ICH accession, this gives local regulators, and in China the regulations are divided between national and local. That is, some of the regulators locally inspect some of the plants. This gives more clout to local regulators to enforce the rules. The outcome of this is still up in the air, but we have certainly seen progress. Another item related to local government support is that local governments, of course, are seeking economic expansion. And as a consequence, they now feel they have permission from the national government. That is, the conservative government officials, all government officials I think are conservative by definition, they are willing to take the risk to invest in biotech companies as opposed to other things. I actually had a meeting today with a couple of government officials, and they said there's not a whole lot for governments to invest in besides biotech and artificial intelligence. So when governments are looking for higher technology companies to bring into their area, there's a strong push to invest in biotechnology companies. Now, because the government prefers to own equipment as opposed to investing in clinical trials, there is still quite a bit of push into purchasing equipment. Companies are still building their own manufacturing plants when it's not in their best interest to do so because, in a sense, they feel they're getting free money, and their investors are pushing them to take advantage of this because it gives them a higher capitalization. But it leads to a somewhat less efficient use of the money because now because the CDMO is typically more efficient in accomplishing manufacturing than is a less experienced manufacturing company, development company. So, among manufacturing trends we see in China are manufacturing for different areas. Now, as Eric said in the introduction, we have a large market, a large patient base here in China. And so there is a lot of what we see in the middle here, manufacturing in China for China. And that is clearly the focus of the current products that are going to market. But as Eric also said, we see a lot of interest in companies to develop their products for more developed country markets. That is the U.S., Europe, Japan, and South Korea. Now, there's also some manufacturing in China for less developed markets, but unlike Indian companies, the Chinese companies have not pursued this as vigorously. Although it was interesting to note recently that Henlius has entered into a large deal in the Southern Hemisphere. But Henlius is one of these startups, remember, that has started by returnees from the U.S., and these are the groups that recognize the benefit of going overseas. And these are the groups that also recognize why it's important to have good quality and must be in compliance with CGMPs. So that's a very important trend for the market. So manufacturing for developed countries is partly driven by costs of manufacturing in developed countries. So if you look at small molecule drugs, you'll see that 80% of the API is produced in China or India, or China and India together. So that's driven by the people wanting to reduce the cost. So there is definitely an opportunity for the more developed countries to lower the amount they spend on drugs by sourcing from lower labor cost countries such as China. We have lower labor costs for manufacturing, and we also have lower labor costs for construction, which means overall we can manufacture drugs for less money. But the local companies here in China see the established markets of U.S. and Europe as very attractive because they get a higher margin, especially now that they have a lower cost. So we see a lot of partnering with locally established distributors for export. That is, the local companies here in China partner with partners in Europe and U.S., in order to export the drugs. We also see, as a consequence of this, a higher quality of manufacturing in the Chinese organization. So a company like any of the big multinationals that comes in to partner with a Chinese company, they're going to hold the manufacturer in China to the same standard that their plants have in Europe and the U.S. This may very well be a higher standard than is required by the regulators. But they will not partner or sell these drugs on behalf of the Chinese manufacturer unless the manufacturer can meet these requirements. Manufacturing for China is driven by price pressure in China. Imported drugs, and there are many that are approved, and by the way, the ability to get an imported drug approved has become easier in the last 2 years, considerably easier, and we see more imported drugs being approved. But they have limited sales because they don't get government reimbursement from the government health plan. So the patients have to pay out of pocket, and they're paying a high price. Local manufacturing, but even if it has a lower price, has a larger total income potential because it has a larger market potential. These expanding markets in China create a large demand. Chinese markets for total pharmaceuticals are growing at 10% plus per year, and for biopharmaceuticals are higher than that. This means that the total market doubles every 7 years. How do we keep up with the growth? Okay. Clearly, that's what's driving the expansion of capacity and more facilities here in China. Now, with respect to manufacturing for less developed areas, let's think about this for a moment. China is slower going into this market, and Indian firms clearly have a lead. And why is that? In part, it's because of the rapid expansion of the Chinese market. For example, if you have to double every 7 years all your capacity, how are you going to keep up with this and manage export? So the focus has been locally on the domestic market. So vaccines have led the way for India. India has a very vibrant vaccine export industry, which has led the technology development that's benefited the biopharmaceuticals with equipment manufacturers and trained staff. China vaccines, on the other hand, are a closed market, little competition, and we've seen a few examples of corruption. There's some very good vaccine companies here, but they don't export, and so that has not driven, there's some export, of course, but not compared to India. And therefore, the vaccine market has not driven the expansion of the biopharmaceutical market in China the way it has in India, and it has not led to the export of products from China the way we've seen in India. And the result has been that particularly the vaccine industry is less competitive to move into other areas. Okay, so we have 3 types of contract development and manufacturing organizations in China. The first is an organization that's dedicated to CDMO work only. And we'll list these. And then we have those that are shared. They have extra capacity. They have their own products. And then we have those. And then there are many Chinese CDMOs focused on mammalian and very few focused on microbial products. So here's a short list of the major CDMOs in China. WuXi Biologics is the largest. They have over 50% of the capacity, and they're continuing to expand. They're expanding worldwide. They're building plants in Ireland and elsewhere. They have a lot of capacity coming online in Wuxi and elsewhere in China. JHL, I mentioned, they're in Wuhan. They have a smaller facility, but they are full. Boehringer Ingelheim also has a small facility. They are very high quality work. 3S Guojian is not a dedicated facility. They have 2 lines, each with 5,000-liter steel tanks built in Switzerland. Beautiful facility. They have their own products. but they have excess capacity, and so they've opened that up and are trying to fill that with outside work. Mabplex and Yantai has two divisions. One is the CDMO, one's doing their own products. Their own products are made in their CMO side. Shang Pharma in Shanghai is a dedicated CDMO. CMAB in Suzhou is also a dedicated CDMO. And Mab Venture in Shanghai has their own products and has a CDMO. The challenges in working with CDMOs in China are basically the same as working with a CDMO in any other country. And the primary criteria for working with any contract manufacturer is, first of all, GMP compliance, because if they can't meet compliance requirements, then why bother to do the work for them? The second, for most companies, is the timing. Can they meet our schedule? This is a challenge today because many of these CDMOs are full for 5 or 6 months in advance, and some longer, and so it's difficult to get into their schedule. And then price-wise, the top CDMOs in China are not price competitive compared to the rest of the world. They charge about the same as the CDMO in U.S. or Europe. And the smaller ones are price competitive. They charge less. They have more to prove at this point. Secondary criteria include, does the equipment match, do they have the technical capability, and can they really manage the project in terms of working with the client and making sure that deliveries occur on time. So development companies, they're serving the CDMOs like Korea GN. There are several companies that develop their own products that have excess capacity. Now the advantage of this is that they have a qualified technical staff because they're making their own products. And most of them have high-quality equipment. The disadvantage of a shared product like this is that the potential competitor has access to proprietary information of the client, and access may be limited because the company's own products may have priority. Okay, now part of what's required in order to be successful in manufacturing biopharmaceuticals is to having the key materials available when you need them. And a good thing about China is that, first of all, we have very strong infrastructure. Most plants have multiple electrical plants supplying them electricity. Some plants, many of the big industrial business parks, have high-pressure steam in the road, so the company has to just tap into it. So electricity and water is also widely available, clean, good water source. Now the top suppliers are also well represented here. Materials are widely available. So GE Healthcare, Merck Millipore, Thermo Fisher Cyclone, Sartorius Stedim, all of the major manufacturers of bioreactor, single-use bioreactor bags and other materials are widely available. There are high-quality steel tank fabricators in China, high-quality welders. All of that supporting structure is also available here in China. There are quality issues in China, and we've seen this over the years, and these have been highlighted in the headlines. But like many news reports, often it's only the bad news that gets reported. There are some challenges here, but mostly they're not related to poor quality production. For example, we talked about these returnees who come back and start companies. But there are probably more than 1,000 of these people, men and women, who have worked overseas and then come back to China, and they get funding and start companies. And they're mostly in the research side. There are probably 100 or so that have come back with experience in manufacturing, and they start the companies or they lead these manufacturing organizations. But within quality assurance, and this is the area that I work in mostly, I have found 12 who have come back from the U.S., and it's just a shortage. So it's a challenge to keep up with the quality people. There's also a widespread copying. You may have read something about the challenges we have with intellectual property control. So in terms of the CDMOs honoring and protecting the client's intellectual property, that's not an issue. The issue we have is the sharing, shall we say, of documents for quality management systems. And the consequence of this is that the companies haven't really had the staff with the capability to improve them, and so many of the quality management systems are substandard. And so when they do a partnership with a major company, that's when the quality management system gets revamped. They get an improvement overall, but that's a challenge for many of these companies. Also, high industry growth means rapid turnover in staffing. So it's not uncommon to have companies with 30% turnover per year. Now, we're fortunate in the CDMO side that companies like Boehringer Ingelheim have very low turnover. WuXi Biologics also has lower than average turnover. And so, in general, the industry is quite stable. But it is one of the challenges that we face in the industry. So that pretty much sums up what I have to say today. I'd like to thank you for your attention and the opportunity to be with you, and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks, Scott. So we do have a couple of questions. The first is, can you elaborate the potential reason for the policy of DS and DP need to be produced at the same facility? And do you expect that it will change later to match the U.S. situation?
That's a very good question. I expect it will change, but we don't know when. Just like the ability to go outside for contract manufacturing of our commercial products only changed recently, and we waited many years for that. So what that means is that for biopharmaceuticals, drug substance and drug product must be made at the same site. Now, that's not been challenged to my understanding, and so we don't know exactly what that means. But that's widely interpreted as being that the company that makes the drug substance must also do the drug product manufacturing for a product that is manufactured in China.
Okay, great. And actually, Scott, before you answer the next question, if you could try to project a little louder, you're a little quiet with the answer. So the next question is, can you discuss the recent legal changes allowing nationwide CMO operations for biologics?
Right. So the NIH Rule was instituted about 2 years ago in 10 different cities and districts around the country. And it was a change that, because prior to this, due to a concern from the regulator's side that if companies went outside, they would not pay close enough attention to manufacturing, biopharmaceuticals, the development company was required to own its own manufacturing and do its own manufacturing and production of its products, drug substance and drug product. And that has changed now to the regulators have realized that CDMOs are inherently better experienced than many of these startup companies. And so the CDMOs, so now startup companies and any company can manufacture its phase 3 clinical test material and its commercial product at an outside CDMO, and that manufacturer can produce it for the Chinese market. But as I said, that still requires both drug substance and drug product at the same site.
Okay. And during your presentation, you touched a little bit about the workforce in China and people coming back who have been trained in the United States. Do you see more people being trained in China in the future, or is that trend going to continue? And what are the opportunities for U.S.-based biopharmaceutical employees to potentially go and work in China? Do you have any comments on that?
Certainly. There's certainly a shortage of experienced staff in all aspects of the industry here in China. We see many people have come back, mostly of Chinese origin, because of the language challenges. I myself find it very difficult from a language perspective to work in a Chinese company all the time. So mostly those who come back are people who can speak Chinese, although there are now many non-Chinese origin people who speak very good Chinese. I see them on TV quite often. And then there are also opportunities because, I mean, one of the challenges for a U.S. person to come to China is the salary is going to be a challenge for any company unless you have specific skills that are attractive. So some of the companies like WuXi Biologics hire people returning from the U.S. who don't speak much Chinese. Some companies have hired people from India who have good quality and regulatory experience to help them with their foreign projects. And there are certainly opportunities, but I think they're fairly limited.
Okay. And virtually all new innovative drugs are Western drugs, and they are imported. Do you see this changing, and what will be required?
So there's a lot of innovation going on in China. There have been some innovative drugs developed first in China, but not very many. But if you look at the number of startup companies that are developing innovative drugs, both small molecules and large molecules, we see many, many organizations developing new products and bringing these through the clinic. I expect that we'll see an expansion in the number of products that originate from China as these development teams become stronger in their ability to bring products to market.
Okay. And Eric, did you have any comments on that topic, or from what you've seen in your report?
I think that, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, I think Scott is on the ground in China, so literally he's seeing this on a daily basis. So I think his responses are very consistent with what we've seen, and his detail is remarkable.
So you mentioned local governments are giving incentives to CDMOs to set up their facilities in their district. Are these incentives also for foreign CDMOs to enter the Chinese market? And are there different considerations or regulations for foreign CDMOs as opposed to local CDMOs?
Yeah, that's a good question because I actually haven't seen any foreign CDMOs setting up in China with the exception of Boehringer Ingelheim. And I don't know whether they received government incentives. They have a very large operation outside of the biopharmaceutical business, and so they're a well-established organization here in China. Certainly in terms of companies and people that want to set up companies in China, the incentives are open to non-Chinese. The challenge is the language, and most of the government people do not speak English. Also, there have been some frictions in the past where foreign startups have been established in China, not necessarily in our industry, but in other industries, where the people received grant money and then didn't stay and follow through with what they promised. And so there is some concern there, and that's one of the reasons why this hasn't been just, non-Chinese origins. It's a general concern for the governments, and that's one of the reasons why they focus on hard assets like equipment and buildings, as opposed to providing soft money that could be used for clinical trials or for hiring people.
And this is Eric. Along that topic, but looking at it from the other direction, I would also note that there is some increasing interest among CDMOs in China to seek opportunities or collaborations with Western companies. So we are seeing acquisitions and investment in and certainly interest in CDMOs and other biologic suppliers in both the U.S. and Europe from outbound investment from China. So it's not just the inbound direction that some of this interest is going, and that's, I think, a relatively new and development over the last few years.
That's true, Eric. We have seen quite a bit of outbound investment. There's a challenge with China because of capital controls, and so it's quite tightly regulated. But there are a number of Chinese companies, drug development companies, not just the CDMOs, but drug development companies that have operations in the U.S. and in Europe. And so they look to build on their success in China by having a satellite organization with skills in research and development in one of the places like Seattle or San Diego or the Boston area, which enables them to access and tap into a larger idea field or the network of ideas that enables them to bring that expertise, transfer that information to the home office.
And Leah, this is Eric. We had one question I think that Scott may be able to respond to that I think might be a relevance regarding, it's kind of a broad brush approach to the issue here, but one of the questions was, what will it take for Western multinational corporations to manufacture their first-line drugs in China? Is that answerable in the wrap-up of a webinar like this?
Yeah. No, that's a good question, Eric. And we have seen investment from the large multinationals in manufacturing plants in China. So Lilly put in, not Lilly, yeah, I think it was Lilly that put in a manufacturing facility. So all of the big insulin manufacturers have had drug product manufacturing plants in China for years. But Lilly, in the last 2 years, built a drug substance manufacturing plant for its insulin products. Okay, and Pfizer has built in Hangzhou a manufacturing facility for biopharmaceuticals. Lonza has talked about building a biopharmaceutical facility in China, and so we see more of the multinationals looking to do that, whether they are going to just produce for the Chinese market or whether they actually export these to Western markets. It's not clear, but there is an opportunity. We do see growth here. I should also mention that the opportunities for government incentives are open to pretty much everybody. And while it's challenging for a company that doesn't have a Chinese connection to take advantage of these, there are Chinese connections available for companies that are interested. And there are a number of folks that we've worked with that are actively seeking these types of partnerships and looking to provide opportunities for companies to develop research centers in China.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for now. So thank you very much, Scott.
You're welcome.
And
thank you for the opportunity.
And Leah, thank you as well.
Yes, and thank you, Eric. This is the last of the BioPlan Associate series on China. All of the archived webcasts in the series are posted on the Bioprocess International website, so if you missed any of those, you can go check them out. We look forward to having you join us at future Bioprocess International Ask the Expert webcasts. Look for those announcements in your inbox. Thank you, and goodbye.